Hi everyone, it's me. Welcome to today's video. We are doing our monthly reading wrap up today. So we are wrapping up the month of March. In this past month, I read 12 books and 9 of them were fantasy. I apparently was just really in a fantasy mood this past month. So yeah, I was just like devouring fantasy after fantasy. And then the other 3 books I read were actually romance. So a very simple breakdown of genres. Literary fiction, I don't know what happened, but I didn't read any of those this month, or just like contemporary general fiction or historical fiction. No, it was just a full fantasy romance month. And yeah, mostly fantasy, but a lot of the fantasies I did read were romantic fantasies or romanticises. So there's a little bit of mix in there. And for my March TBR, I did read 5 out of 5. So pat on my own back for that one. And I don't know if you guys noticed or not, but I did get a new lens for my camera. So I don't know if things look different right now, but this lens is supposed to look better. And especially it's supposed to look better in like low light, which is actually perfect that we're testing it today because it is one of the darkest days I have ever seen. It's like 9:30 a.m. so the sun should be up, but it's just like very gloomy, cloudy, and rainy today. So hopefully this lens holds up in the lower light today. Let's get into the books that I read. So we'll go through all the fantasies first since I read 9 of them. But the first one I read was The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern. This is not going to stand up. These first 3 I read are covered in a reading vlog where booktubers chose my reads, and this one was highly recommended by many booktubers. So I'm so glad I finally read this, and I'm also really happy because it lived up to all the hype. So if you don't know what The Night Circus is, this is a fantasy and it follows a circus that only opens at night. It's very mysterious. It's a traveling circus, so you could just be living your normal life and then overnight this circus just pops up out of nowhere. And the circus is just so amazing. It's captivating. Everyone loves it. But behind the scenes, unbeknownst to everyone, there's actually this like secret magical duel or game happening behind the scenes between these 2 magicians, Celia and Marco, who have grown up their entire lives training to be in this competition with each other. But as we see this competition progress, the 2 actually fall in love. And this just sets off a domino effect of many consequences. And let me tell you, I was so nervous going into this book because I knew it was so loved. I've heard so much about it. So like my expectations were really high, and I always get scared when my expectations are really high because obviously it's harder for a book to live up, but this book lived up. It's a very moody book. It's a very vibes book. It's very atmospheric. I would say the plot, I enjoyed it, but I can see why, I don't know, some people might say it moves slow. It is one of those types of plots that spans over a long time, sort of like Addie LaRue, where it's just like a slower story that spans over years and years and years and years. And we have this timeline that jumps back and forth between times, obviously, and then character POVs and also locations because the circus does travel. So we do follow the POVs of our 2 main characters, Celia and Marco, and we also follow a couple other like supporting character POVs as well. So it's one of those books where you never really know the full picture. You're getting sort of these little bits and pieces from everyone, but since the circus itself is this big mystery, and then also this like competition game itself is also a mystery, it's one of those books where you're reading and you don't really fully know what's going on, like completely. You have your own ideas, you're kind of going with it, you're getting bits and pieces as you go, but you really don't know what's going on. Like for the majority of this book, I did not even know what the competition was. You kind of know, but it's so abstract that you just don't. There's nothing like solid that you can understand. But at the same time, it's a book that is so easy to read, because I think the last book I read that was kind of like abstract was This Is How You Lose the Time War, and that was like, that went over my head. The writing was beautiful, but it was like harder to read. This one's not like that at all. So when I say abstract, I don't want that to sound intimidating. It is a very easily read, easy digestible book, but just like the environment itself is, it's kind of made up. There are no rules. Sort of like Caraval, I guess you could say, where the rules seem very arbitrary. It's made up as you go. but it's fun. And something I really liked particularly about the writing in this book is that while most of the book was written in like a third-person POV, there were few little parts in this book, like kind of in between excerpts, that were written in second-person POV, and I really enjoyed that. It was like, I think the opening of this book is actually written in second POV. It casts you as the reader, as someone who has just seen the circus for the first time. Let me find it. Yeah, it's the first page. So you are amongst them, of course. Your curiosity got the better of you, as curiosity is wont to do. You stand in the fading light, the scarf around your neck pulled up against the chilly evening breeze, waiting to see yourself exactly what kind of circus only opens once the sun sets. And then, yeah, as the book goes on, we get excerpts of you like walking into the circus for the first time, and it's like you go into this tunnel and you see all these lights and it's all black and white. Like, it just puts you literally into the circus, and I found that really, really cool. There is obviously, as I mentioned in the plot summary, a little bit of a romance in here. It's definitely a subplot, and I would say it's one of those more off the page romances. Like, you do get moments of it obviously, but it's not a romance book, so it's not going to show you all the details that you would get in a romantasy or a contemporary romance. And I would honestly say that this romance would not make sense in a contemporary setting at all, but because we're set in this abstract circus world, I actually really liked the romance in here. Like, there's no real reason for it. There's no tangible reason as to why these two characters should be together, but it just makes sense at the night circus. And this ending was really, really satisfying to me. The way that we saw all the pieces finally coming together as a book where while you're reading it, you don't really know what the full big picture is. You do get that at the end, and it was so satisfying to read. It's one of those like bittersweet, tragically beautiful endings that I love. And yeah, I'm so happy it lived up. It was my first read of the month, and it was an immediate 5 stars. So it was a great start to March. The next book I read, this one's not gonna stand up either, King of Scars by Leigh Bardugo. If you guys don't know what this is, it is set in the Grishaverse, so in the same universe as Six of Crows, as Shadow and Bone, and this is the first in a duology that takes place after the events of all of those books. So if you have read Shadow and Bone and Six of Crows and you love Nikolai, Zoya, and Nina, you should definitely read it. I just had so much fun reading this because we follow these characters that we already know and we've already followed before and we love. I feel like when you fall in love with a universe, anything you read in that universe is going to be a good experience. Whether or not it's a perfect book, it's just be fun spending time in that world with those characters. And yeah, while I mentioned those 3 main characters in this book, there are also a lot of secondary characters that appear in this book as well, from both the Shadow and Bone and Six of Crows. And to go through, I guess, like my thoughts on the 3 main characters we followed, with Zoya's story, absolutely love. Absolutely ate it up. I think she was my favorite part of this book, which was unexpected because I feel like in Shadow and Bone, she went from this journey from being a hated character to a respected character for me. I didn't like necessarily love her by the end of Shadow and Bone, but I respected her character and who she was. But in this book, she became like mother to me. Like, I'm obsessed with Zoya. I love the arc she went on, and she is probably like one of my top 3 characters in the Grishaverse now. I love her so, so much. We also followed Nikolai in this book, of course. That's why I read this duology, is because I knew that Nikolai was a prominent character. And Nikolai's journey in this, I would say, I don't want to say disappointed, but I feel like I expected more from his journey just because he was my favorite character in the Shadow and Bone trilogy, and I wanted more from him in this book. I do like the arc he went on. I do understand. There was a lot of like, it's hard to talk about this book without spoiling like the other books in the Grishaverse, but he went through this sort of like recovery healing journey, let's say, and I think in the next book in this duology, he's really gonna shine. But I feel like in this book, he took a bit more of a slower arc, and as I said, I appreciated it. I just had really high expectations for Nikolai, but I think it's gonna be really good in the next book, his story. And then for Nina, I think I appreciated her story and I understood the importance of what she was going through, but I feel like I am actually really attached to Six of Crows Nina and her arc and story there, and my heart is just still at the restaurant with her. I think that kind of blocked my enjoyment of her story in this book. Maybe the next book will change my mind, but as of right now, I'm really stuck at the restaurant with her. So I feel like overall this book was slower at the beginning. Once we hit part 2, like right at the halfway point, everything picked up and things got exciting again. I found the story in here to be more focused on the gods of this world, like the saints, and I found that interesting because you see a lot of that. I don't think you see too much of that in Six of Crows, but in Shadow and Bone you do see that as a prominent thing that exists in this world, but we dive a lot deeper into that in this book, and I found that really interesting as part of the world building. This book definitely had one of those endings where like you just need to read the next book, and I don't have it yet, and I'm currently on a book buying ban, so it's kind of slowly killing me inside that I can't continue this right now, but I do want to get the second book as soon as I lift myself from this book buying ban. Overall, I would say this isn't the best Grishaverse book. It feels looser than most of the other ones have, but it is a really fun way to expand your Grishaverse experience. And also, I have heard that the second book in this duology is the one to read. Like, this book is to build up what happens in the second book, and I've heard the second book is the one that's amazing. So I'm really excited to read the second one. I hope it lives up. The third book I read in that video was The Prison Healer by Lynette Noni. This one has also come very highly requested. I've seen a lot of people online reading this book. This is a YA fantasy. We follow Kiva, who has been in prison she was like 7 years old when she was captured, but over the 10 years that she's been in this prison, she has learned her way around the system. She's taken the role of the prison healer, which is, compared to the other prison jobs, like kind of a cushy job, like definitely safer, definitely like nicer environment. And Kiva's also slid into the good graces of the warden, so she gets a little bit of special treatment that way. But as a consequence of that, the other prisoners don't trust her, they don't like her, they think she's gonna like spy on them and tattle on them to the warden, so no one in the prison really likes her. Outside of this prison, there is this sort of political unrest going on, little whispers of a rebellion, and one day the rebel queen shows up at the prison. She's been captured. She is not in a good state. She's like unconscious. She is clearly very, very sick, but no one knows what's wrong with her. But Kiva is assigned to try and heal her because this rebel queen has to go through the series of 3 trials that will determine her fate. She doesn't know how to heal her. She doesn't know how to keep her alive. Now Kiva's just stuck in this really, really tight spot and ends up needing to do some crazy things. This book was so fast moving. The writing is really easy to read, really digestible. It has a really nostalgic feeling because we follow this structure of like the 3 trials. And I know it's a YA fantasy trope that is so used and used and used, but I eat it up every time. I love trials. I think they're so fun to read. I think there's so much creativity that can be put into stories with trials because, I don't know, you can just spin the trials in such unique ways, and I find it really fun to read every single time. So I ate that up in this book. I don't think this was the perfect book. There were some things that were confusing to me with the intentions of some of the characters and why they did certain things that they did. And this book does feel really YA when you're reading it. A lot of things get repeated over and over again, and I feel like as maybe an adult reader, I didn't need that much repetition with certain sentences and thoughts and stuff that kept coming up, but I do love these characters a lot. I can see this series becoming amazing as the books go on. Yeah, there's just so much potential in this world, I feel like. There are a lot of like nice twisties at the end of the story, which are fun to read as well. Mostly predictable, but there was one big one that caught me off guard, and I was so surprised I didn't catch it. But yeah, that's The Prison Healer. Okay, we continued a couple more series. Let's see if this one will stand because it's a hardcover. Maybe? It's kind of tilting. I read Her Radiant Curse by Elizabeth Lim to finish off the 6 of Cranes series. This series is built up of like an original duology, and then this one is the prequel to the duology. It is another YA fantasy. This one is more fairy tale feeling. With 6 Crimson Cranes, I always say if you like something like Once Upon a Broken Heart but mixed in with Asian folklore, you would love 6 Crimson Cranes, and I really loved 6 Crimson Cranes, but I will say the rest of the books in this series I didn't love as much. This one is a prequel. It follows the stepmother character that appears in 6 Crimson Cranes. It follows her story as she was cursed as a little girl. Her father brought her out when she was a kid to be sacrificed essentially to this like demon witch. She doesn't get taken as the sacrifice, but instead she gets this curse put on her where she's kind of like one with the snakes. Like she has this snake face, snakes can talk to her, people see that as a bad thing. So for the rest of her childhood and growing up, her father always kept her locked up so the other villagers wouldn't be able to see her because he saw her as, you know, something shameful, something that wasn't good for the family reputation. And while this is all happening, she does have a sister, a younger sister, who has always been known for her radiant beauty. When her sister turns 16 or 17, like of age essentially, her father comes up with a scheme to basically sell her off to a royal family to like marry some royal. And Chani, who is our main character, is really against this, will do anything to protect her little sister. So we go on this, you know, big journey that stems from that. I really like the beginning of this book and the end of this book, but the middle, I don't think was really my favorite. I just find that with Elizabeth Lim's writing, I really like her character development. I really like the way she tells relationships, especially between like siblings and family members. And I really like the way she writes fairy tales and stories about curses and bargains and that sort of thing. But once she gets into, you know, quests or combat, I don't really vibe with her writing style and how she tells those types of stories. And the middle of this book was very questy. It was very combat-y. There were a lot of trials and fights and stuff. I don't know what it is, but I just don't vibe with the way she writes that stuff, which is so interesting because generally I do like quests and combat and trials. I was just talking about how I found the trials in the Prison Healer to be so much fun, but I don't enjoy the way Elizabeth Lim does it, but I love her like curses and fairy tales, which is why I really loved Six Crimson Cranes and didn't really love her other two books. There were some good moments in this book. There were some Easter eggs for sure. There were some good full circle moments, and there were parts of it that I really enjoyed. I just didn't like how most of the book was focused on combat and quests. I didn't really like the story we went on this one. I am sad that I didn't love it as much as I thought I would. The Mime Order from Samantha Shannon was next. This is the second book in the Bone Season series. It is a sci-fi fantasy. I think it is a little bit more sci-fi because we are more in the future. It is more like technical, like technological. We're set in future London in a world where people are clairvoyant, or they're not clairvoyant. And the clairvoyants are like the magical people, and they're being hunted because the government sees them as a threat. Our main character, Paige, is a clairvoyant, obviously. So she has grown up in this crime syndicate. It's an underground operation. It's very gang, very crime, but it's kind of necessary because the syndicate, although it's ruthless, it does work to protect clairvoyants from being found by the government. So Paige fits into this world, and at the beginning of the Bone Season, she gets caught, unfortunately, and brought to prison. And while she is in prison, she finds out all these crazy things that the government is doing. I can't really say anything more about the plot, to be honest, because that would be like a huge spoiler for the first book, but I really love this series. It is going to be a 7-book series, which is so long. This book I found to be pretty decent as a sequel. I think I enjoyed the first book more actually, but I appreciated that at the beginning of this book, it really eases you back into the world and introduces you to like all the characters and kind of recaps generally like what happened in the first book, because as someone who doesn't read series like back to back, sometimes the details get lost in my head. I found this to be a really gentle way to ease you back into the world, which I really appreciated. On top of that, I find that this world is just like really complex. There's so many words and terms for everything. It's one of those worlds where there's multiple words for every object, multiple names for every person. And sometimes I find things a little bit hard to track in this world, but the writing is so easy to read that even if I don't fully understand every single specific term that is mentioned, I still always understand what is going on. Like, it's not hard to read. It doesn't hurt my brain to read it, but sometimes you're just like, okay, there's that object over there that's called this word, and I don't know what it means, but I know it's there, and generally I think I know what it kind of does. So we're just gonna go with it. I keep going with this book for the vibe. And I actually find that aspect of this world in general to be really fun to read, because as someone who reads so many books and can usually predict so many twists and endings, it is nice to read a book sometimes where I'm not thinking ahead. I'm just in it for the vibe. I'm going at it page by page, and my brain is so preoccupied with just identifying these terms and names and stuff that I'm not thinking ahead, and I'm not thinking about what's gonna happen next. You're just kind of going with it, and it's really fun to do that because yeah, I predict everything in books, I feel like these days. It's fun to read a book where you're not sitting there like, oh, I know what's gonna happen in the next 100 pages. I think similar to King of Scars, this book does start out really slow though, and then it picks up in the second half. I think the last like 200 pages in this book I devoured in one sitting. Maybe it wasn't 200 pages, maybe it was like 150. I read within an hour, which is quite quick for my pace. I just sat down, devoured it. The ending was so good in this book, and I'm really excited to read the third book in the series. That is The Mime Order. And then speaking of books that I can predict, Rebel Witch by Kristen Ciccarelli. This was one of my most anticipated reads of the year. It was one of my most anticipated like series. I was really looking forward to this book, and unfortunately I didn't love it. I think that's an unpopular opinion actually. I have heard a lot of people loving this book, and I think it's like overall the ratings have been flooding in as really positive. I think I'm in the minority here. This is the second book in the Heartless Hunter or Crimson Moth duology. It is a YA romantasy. We follow a witch and a witch hunter. Our main character is Rune, she's the witch, and we're in this world where witches are being hunted because years and years back the witches used to rule this world, but they were overthrown by humans, and so now they're just trying to hunt out all the witches so they don't build up their strength and take over again. So Rune is not only fighting to keep her identity safe, but she's also taken up this secret identity as the Crimson Moth. She kind of spies, goes incognito to try and save witches from being captured and executed. In the first book, she meets Gideon, who is one of the most prominent witch hunters, and they do this whole cat and mouse thing where they're not trusting each other. Obviously, one is hunting the other. They're kind of hunting each other, but then they like each other at the same time. It's a romantasy. I really thought the first book was really fun. It was predictable, and there were definitely holes in the world and plot, but I was just having so much fun reading the first book. I didn't care. Like, I just devoured it, and I was expecting the same thing for the second book, but for some reason, those plot holes and character inconsistencies I couldn't deal with while reading this book. I think it's because I have this pet peeve where characters, especially in a romance, take like 20 steps back. Like, we've had one book of them building up their relationship and stuff, and yeah, well, things happen in the first book too. I don't know how to talk about this without spoiling things. By the end of the first book, there is conflict between them, okay? That's all I'll say, but in this book, it just felt like a lot of those connections and trust and the things that they learned about each other, they just forgot. That's just a pet peeve of mine. I don't know, I found, maybe this is my fault because I was expecting something different from this book, but I thought we'd have the cat and mouse story in the first book, and the second one, we would expand more on just like the fantasy plot. And generally that's what I like in romantasies. Like, you set up the romance, but then there's bigger fish to fry. And maybe this second book was just another cat and mouse romantasy, which that's how it's advertised, and I wasn't in the mood for a cat and mouse romantasy anymore. I just wanted I wanted the fantasy plot to go crazy. Like, after the events of the end of the first book, I thought we were gonna go deeper into the world. I thought the fantasy plot was going to be really, really fun, and we got like a little bit of that in this book, but it was definitely more about just like cat and mouse again, like a redo of the same cat and mouse story that we got in the first book, and I didn't want that. There was so much miscommunication in this book, like so much, and that is one of my biggest pet peeves also. I know a lot of you are saying you liked the miscommunication because there was reason for it, and on one hand, while I do agree, I just think it took up way too much of this book. Like, we could have had 100 pages of miscommunication and then 300 pages of plot, but it felt like we had 300 pages of miscommunication and then 100 pages of plot, and I think the ratio was just off for me. Overall, I just wanted more plot in this. I think we had some mentions of like, oh, that's something cool and new in the magic, or like, ooh, like that's kind of an interesting plot line, but we didn't go deeper into any of these little branches. It was mostly just focused on the romance, that we spent like one sentence on the cool new magic feature, and we spent like one chapter on the cool new plot, and then the rest was just miscommunication. Overall, I do like by the end where the story went, but I just thought, yeah, the way it was told could have been done differently, like structured differently, and everything was extremely, extremely predictable. I don't know, it was okay. I didn't hate it. As I mentioned, I do like where we ended up in the end. I do overall like the two of them as a couple, maybe, but I think it's mostly because I have such fond memories of the first book, and then this one was like, I don't know. I'm really mixed on this one, so Rebel Witch. All right. I think I can confidently say this was probably the most anticipated read for the entire book community this year. I feel like every single one of us was reading this book on release week. Like, immediately, I was talking to so many people while reading this book. We were all reading at the same time. I feel like every single booktuber I watched either featured this book like in a vlog or did a reading vlog with it, like all at the same time. We all read this together, and I absolutely love that. I don't think this book requires any explanation, but to explain it in one sentence, this is Haymitch's story in the Hunger Games. It's a prequel. It takes place in between The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes and the original trilogy, and oh my god, it was perfect. It was so good. It made me cry. I talk a lot about it in a vlog. It's the thumbnail, and I'm like crying in the thumbnail. This was so good. It was the perfect bridge between like the first prequel we got and to the original trilogy. There were so many Easter eggs, so many connections. It fed us. And I was saying that this book felt like reading a fan fiction, but even better because it fed us everything we wanted. Like everything we've been wondering for years and years and years about this universe and the way people are connected. It gave us all of that. So it felt like a fan fiction reading it, but even better because it was written by Suzanne Collins and it was, you know, obviously written perfectly and it's official, it's canon. I, after reading this book, really want to read Catching Fire. I feel like there are a lot of connections between the events that happen in this book and how Haymitch acted or like the decisions he made in Catching Fire. I need to reread the original trilogy. Those books are currently at my parents' house and I need to bring them over here so I can reread them. This brought me right back into the world. I also think the messaging in this book is obviously so important. Suzanne Collins always embeds these messages in her books that they're so strong and you really get them through her books, but they're also not like completely in your face in an annoying way, if that makes sense. Like the politics and the messaging is all there, but it makes sense why it's there and it's integrated so perfectly into the story. There's something about this book that felt so much more adult, and the kids in this book in the Hunger Games felt so much more like kids compared to when I was reading the original trilogy. And I don't know if it's because I was younger when I was reading the original trilogy, like I was a teenager myself, so reading about Katniss and Peeta and everyone, like they felt like my age or older than my age, but now reading this, I'm like, these kids are so young and it just hits even harder. So yeah, again, I do want to reread the original trilogy to see if I get that same feeling. But yeah, a traumatizing read for sure, but an amazing read. So far, probably my favorite read of the year. This was incredible. I read Water Moon. This was the second book I read after Sunrise on the Reaping, and I was just in a mood where I couldn't read anything like serious, let's say. I was just craving cozy vibes after that book because it was so intense. But this is Water Moon by Samantha Soto Yambao. I honestly feel like this was pretty much perfect to read after Sunrise on the Reaping because it just gave me, I don't know, it felt fuzzier. It felt softer than the Hunger Games, but this is a cozy fantasy. It's very Studio Ghibli style, very Ghibli vibe. Actually, Studio Ghibli was mentioned in this book itself, so it knew what it was doing. It's very whimsical, it's very like nonsensical, it's very like made up. This book felt like a fever dream of metaphors. So in this book, we start off in a pawn shop where people can sell their regrets or like the choices that they regret. This pawn shop is disguised as a ramen restaurant. So people will be lining up for this ramen restaurant thinking that's what they want. Like they're just hungry. And most people do end up at the ramen restaurant when they walk through the doors. But some people, if they have some unfinished business, if they have some sort of a regret that they've been stewing on, they walk through the doors and instead of finding themselves at the ramen restaurant, they find themselves in this pawn shop and they are confused. They don't know why they're there, but then they meet the owner and they're a little confused, but they kind of go with it. And so Hannah is the daughter of the owner of this pawn shop. And at the beginning of the book, it is like the eve of the day that she takes over for the first time. Her dad, the current owner, is going to retire and she's going to step into his shoes. But when she wakes up that morning on her first day, she finds the pawn shop has been robbed. Her father is missing, something very precious has been stolen, and then oddly enough, this mysterious guy shows up and instead of her offering to help him, which is what normally happens, he offers to help her, which is a wild turn of events, and the two of them end up going on this journey to find out what happened, who robbed them, where her father went. And yeah, it's just a very whimsical story. It feels like a dream, like you're just hopping through these very dream-like environments. The writing is absolutely beautiful. It's a story that's just very fun to follow. It's quirky, it's refreshing, it's creative. I really liked it. And I think kind of similar to The Night Circus, the idea of the story has the potential to get very confusing because it's so abstract. But in terms of Water Moon, we were so like one track single-minded on one purpose that it did not feel confusing at all. Like it was just one constant moving story. I enjoyed it. I had a good time reading it, but I will say there was a bit of romance, like a romance subplot in this book. And I feel like this is one of those books that didn't need the romance in it. It could have just been the blossoming of a great friendship and it would have read the same way. I don't think the romance added anything to the story and maybe even took away a little bit from it because I wasn't really feeling it that much. I didn't really understand it. And there was actually one point point in this book. This is not a spicy book at all. It's not smutty. There's no like smut scenes, but there was one moment in the romance where we got a little bit physical. Definitely still all closed door, but it got physical enough that it felt jarring to me, because in this world, everything is so not physical. Everything is so mental. It's very magic. You can step into a puddle and then come out the other side somewhere else. Like the rules and the laws of physics, they don't exist here. But there was this one physical moment in the romance that just like, I was like, whoa, there's a human body that's tangible here. And I don't know, it just like threw me off a little bit. So yeah, I feel like that moment was not necessary, and a lot of the romance maybe wasn't necessary. But again, I did really thoroughly enjoy this book. I would love to see this adapted Ghibli style, because I want to watch it happen. I don't think my imagination is good enough to fully come up with the amazing vast scenes in this book. Like, I want to see someone else draw it for me, because I'm not talented enough. But yeah, it was a really good time. I would recommend it if you need something light, easy, and just cozy. Very good for a rainy day, very good for like escapism. Our last fantasy book, although this one was definitely more romance and less fantasy, was A Fragile Enchantment by Alice Saft. It's very Regency era vibes, it's very Bridgerton vibes, but we follow Neve. I think that's how you say her name. It's spelled N-I-A-M-H, and I think it's pronounced Neve, I think, but please correct me if I'm wrong. She designs clothing for a living. She is from this poor village, but she has a magical talent where she can sew like feelings and emotions into clothing. But yeah, Neve makes a living doing this. She is struggling to make a living. She's trying to support her mother and her grandmother, when one day she gets invited by the royal family that is across the sea to help design the prince's outfits for his upcoming wedding. And she's like, oh, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I could go and do this job, and then we'd basically be good forever. The one problem is this royal family is they don't like them politically, because Neve's people have been very oppressed under this rule. And so yeah, Neve has all these issues with how this royal family is ruling, and then her grandma and her mom also are like, why would you go help these people? They're like oppressors, they suck. But Neve goes on and does it anyways, and she meets the prince, who is this very standoffish guy that might give her more troubles than she was bargaining for. So that's her story. It is a romantic story. I feel like it's definitely more romantic than fantasy. And it was really interesting reading this, because I feel like this is a book that could have honestly been told without the fantasy. Like how Watermoon could have been told without the romance. This didn't necessarily need the magic. Like, it was fun having it there, but the same story could have been told as just a historical romance. The magic added a sort of whimsical vibe to it, but as I was reading it, I was like, I feel like this doesn't have to be here. I don't know, it was a weird feeling. And while reading this book, I just found that I had no strong feelings towards it. Like, I finished the book and I didn't even know what to think about it. So I gave it a 3 stars, because I'm like, I don't know if I liked it or didn't like it. Like, I didn't not like it, but I didn't love it. Like, I didn't like it in particular. So I'm very middle of the road on this one. And I was honestly struggling to find like thoughts to say about this book. Like, this very rarely happens to me, where I read a book and I'm just like, okay, and I don't have thoughts. I don't have a good review to say about this book, which is very strange. But what I can say is this book definitely feels very Bridgerton. We have the whole courting season going on. We even have this anonymous gossip column, very like Lady Whistledown. It was fine to read. I enjoyed the experience, but I feel like I finished this book yesterday and I feel like it's already left my head. Like, it's not one that will stick with me for a long time. It didn't even stick with me for a short time. It's not like I didn't enjoy reading it. I just don't particularly feel for it. Oh, there was a found family, like a little bit of a found family in this that was cute reading. I think I liked that. The romance I found was just like fine. I think maybe the ending of it wasn't as satisfying as I wanted it to be. Like, it was very told to us. It was just like, oh, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then they lived happily ever after, versus like actually seeing the characters go through it. I don't know, this is a weird one for me. If you have any more thoughts on this book, please leave them in the comments, because I feel like I did a horrible job reviewing this one. Okay, we're getting into the romances. I read First Time Caller by B.K. Borison. I thought this one was cute. It did what a rom-com needed to do, but this one follows Aiden, who is the host of a talk show, like sort of a radio show, like a podcast type of a thing. His podcast talks about love, but he himself has actually recently fallen out of love. So at the beginning of this book, he's this very grumpy character. He doesn't care what he's talking about, and he's just like lost all passion. On the other side, we have Lucy, who is a single mom, and in very Sleepless in Seattle fashion, her 13-year-old daughter calls into the radio show show and kind of forces Lucy into talking to the host because her daughter just wants to fix her dating life. She's worried about her mom. She's like, Mom, you haven't dated since I was born. You need to get yourself out there. So then Lucy and Aiden talk. They immediately have this really good banter. Their podcast episode goes viral, and yeah, it's just a very Sleepless in Seattle story. Basically a Sleepless in Seattle retelling. And it's funny because actually the week before I read this book, I watched Sleepless in Seattle for the first time. I know. I don't know how I have never watched that movie. It's like a classic rom-com. And as I was watching it, I literally said out loud to Huffy, if this movie was made in this day and age, this would be like a podcast that went viral on TikTok. And that's literally what happened in this book. And I'm like, I just literally thought about the plot of this book the week before I read it. Like, I don't know, it was this weird moment. But yeah, I thought this was really cute. The previous books I read from BK Borson were Love Light Farms, which I found as a, a decent Christmas romance book, and then In the Weeds, which was also in that series, but I did not like that one. So I had almost given up on BK Borson, but I will say that her writing I feel like has improved a lot in this one. Her banter is better. I feel like her creativity has gotten better. And this one, as I mentioned, it did the job. It does the job as a cute rom-com. I don't think it was like my absolute favorite of all time. I will say I feel like the, I don't know, middle of this book felt like it started to drag on. I feel like this book had insta-love, but was trying to be a slow burn, which doesn't work for me because when it's so obvious that the characters have like instantly fallen in love with each other, then they sort of drag it on because they're like, oh no, but it's not. I don't love him. It's just lust. I don't know. That's been annoying me lately when that happens in romances. Like if you're gonna give me a slow burn, give me a true slow burn. There were some editing issues. There were definitely some continuity issues that I caught. And as I mentioned, I just sort of lost steam maybe at like the 2/3 mark of this book, but it picked up at the end. I found the ending really cute. Oh, you know what? The third act conflict was very miscommunication, which I've been saying in this wrap up that I don't enjoy, but I don't know. It's cute. I liked it. Did not love it necessarily. Okay, on my Kindle, I read Deep End. I was really curious but also hesitant to read this one because a lot of people that I know and who know my book taste were like, Jamie, you're not gonna like this book. And lo and behold, I did not love this book, but not for the reasons that most people would have probably thought. I'm gonna tell you what this book is about in case you haven't read it, because I feel like the Goodreads summary and the synopsis on the back of this book does not do this book justice at all. Like it does not describe this book very well. We follow Scarlett, who is a competitive diver. She's really talented, but at the beginning of the book, she is suffering from an injury that occurred at a competition the last year. Physically, she's healed, but she has this mental block, sort of like the twisties. Oh, I can't remember what they call it in diving. Ooh, it was mentioned in this book. It's called the twisties in gymnastics, like what Simone Biles had, but it's called something else in diving. I can't think of it right now, but it's essentially that idea. She is seeing a psychologist or therapist and trying to get over that mental block so she can continue diving. On the side, she's also an Allie Hazelwood STEM girly. She is currently really focused on school because her diving is not going so well currently, so she's like reinvested her energy into her academics. At the beginning of the book, her diving friend, Penn, who has been dating this guy named Lucas, the captain of the swim team for like a long time. Everyone thought they were endgame. They break up at the beginning of this book and Penn confides in Scarlett and is like, yeah, he's super into BDSM, so it wasn't gonna work because that was really weird for me. Scarlett says, oh, you know what? I'm into BDSM, so maybe I could like help you two through it. But instead, Penn decides, hey, you two are both into BDSM, so why don't you, my friend, and you, my ex-boyfriend, do it together. It's just this like really weird setup which threw me off, but I was like, you know what? We like creativity. We like reading about new things. So I had hopes for this storyline, and I also had hopes for the BDSM storyline, even as a non-smut lover, because I found the beginning of this book when we were setting up that BDSM premise, a lot of it was about the psychology of BDSM, which kind of went along with the theme of psychology with Scarlett's mental block with diving, and I thought that this book would go a lot more into that, but it didn't, and it focused more on the romance, which I guess makes sense. This is a romance book, but I feel like with a plot like that, this book would have been better told as a literary fiction or a contemporary fiction. Like as a general fiction book, I honestly feel like the premise of this would have been an interesting story to read, but I feel like because it was told in a romance way, it didn't work for me. Like, I wanted the book to go into more of the psychology of things, but instead it was just like the romance is the answer to everything. And I found that to be a cop-out with all of these different themes going on, and I was honestly disappointed in that because I found the premise to be really interesting and unique actually. I do like Ali Hazelwood's writing, and I think the writing in this, there was some good banter in there and some funny moments in there. I found at like the 40% mark, I lost interest and then I couldn't get my interest back. And then the last book I read this month was Wait For It by Mariana Zapata. This is one of her very typical contemporary romances, slow burn. We follow adults, which I do like the adult characters that she writes, but in this one she follows Diana, who is the guardian of 2 boys. Throughout the book there's this theme where she holds a lot of imposter syndrome with this setup because she's like, but I'm not their real mom, but I feel like I kind of am because I have been raising them forever and ever, and I do feel like their mom, but I'm just like not biologically their mom. So she struggles a lot with that. At the beginning of the book, she has moved into a new home and she's just trying to give these 2 boys the best life that she can give them. And then she meets off her standoffish but handsome neighbor, and we go on this emotional story with that, with her settling into this new environment and then struggling with her 2 boys and then building this romance. Overall, I do like her slow burn stories. All her characters, I feel like all the books I've read from her take the same arc of like strangers to friends to lovers, and I think the way she builds romances are very healthy, which is refreshing to read in a world full of rivals to lovers, enemies to lovers, where certain relationships may not, you know, in the real world be that healthy. It's nice to read her books. And I also like how she writes like personal journeys with her characters as well. There's always a lot of like inner growth, and her books are always, they're just a breath of fresh air. They feel really good to read, and her books do read a lot like contemporary fiction with a side plot of romance. The romance is obviously prominent in her books, but there's a lot more going on, and that makes her books more interesting to read for me compared to just like a romance. But this book, okay, this was too much. This was 670 pages, and I feel like what we went through in this book, like although it was a lot of emotional healing, we didn't need 670 pages to get through that. That's almost 700 pages. I personally don't think contemporary romances should be over 400 pages. It should be 400 or less. While reading this, I could see a lot of places where scenes could have been edited out or trimmed down. There's a lot of editing that needs to be done in this book in general. There were continuity issues, and yeah, just a lot of things where I'm like, did we need to see that happening? Because like, where did we progress with this scene? Like, what did we learn? What did we get from it? In a lot of scenes, it was just like, we didn't get anything from the scene that we didn't already know or didn't already get from like 3 scenes previous. That was a big issue with this book. I think because it was so long, I ended up also kind of losing steam, not because the story was bad and not because the writing was bad, but because it was just so long. Like, it did not have to be like that. High Sage. Overall, good journey, but did we need all of that? I think my favorite book from her still is From Lukov with Love, and all of her books are really long, including that one, but I feel like because in that one we went through this figure skating journey, I feel like we had more like plot-wise in that one. This one was fine. It could have been 200 pages shorter. Those are the 12 books I read in March. These books have been read, so let's get them onto the shelves. And I'm gonna leave you guys here for now. I hope you liked this video. If you did, please leave me a like and a comment. If you don't know what to comment down below, let me know what you read in March and what you liked and disliked. If you like me, subscribe, do that bell thing, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!